Think about this for a second. Right now, sitting in a drawer or a filing cabinet somewhere in your house, you probably have a single piece of paper that proves you exist. Your birth certificate. Without it, you cannot get a passport, you cannot get a driver's license, you cannot get a social security number, you cannot enroll in school, open a bank account, get married, or even prove that you are a citizen of the country you were born in. That one document is the bedrock of your entire legal identity. It is the first official thing that ties your name to a time, a place, and a nation. Now here is where things get unsettling. For the first 126 years of America's existence, that document did not exist. There was no federal system for recording births. There was no standardized form. There was no government office keeping track of who was born, where, or when. From 1776 all the way through the end of the 19th century, the United States of America, the most ambitious democratic experiment in human history, had no reliable way of knowing whether you were even real. If you were born on a farm in rural Ohio in 1860, or in a tenement in lower Manhattan in 1880, the government had no official record of your arrival on this earth. You were just there, a person who existed because the people around you said so. So how did the government know you existed? How did it tax you, draft you into war, or decide whether you could vote? The answer is a fascinating and deeply strange patchwork of church ledgers, family Bibles, local gossip, handshake agreements, and sworn testimony from your neighbors. And the story of how America finally got around to creating the birth certificate is not just some dry bureaucratic footnote. It is a story about power, about who gets counted and who gets erased, about child labor and immigration and world wars, and about the slow grinding construction of the modern state. It reveals an America that most people have completely forgotten, a country where your identity was not a file in a database, but a story told by the people who knew you. Let us start at the very beginning, because in order to understand why America had no birth certificates, you need to understand what kind of country it was. When the first European colonists crossed the Atlantic and set up shop along the eastern seaboard, they brought their record-keeping traditions with them. But those traditions were not governmental. They were religious. In England, parish priests had been keeping registers of births, marriages, and deaths since the 1500s. These church records were maintained not because the state demanded them, but because the church needed them for its own purposes, tracking who had been baptized, who had received sacraments, who was married in the eyes of God. When English settlers arrived in Virginia and Massachusetts, they carried the same habit. The local minister or town clerk would jot down christenings and burials in a leather-bound ledger, and that was about as official as it got. Now, the colonies did make some early attempts at civil registration. Virginia's General Assembly passed a law in 1632 requiring all ministers to keep track of christenings, marriages, and burials. Massachusetts followed in 1639 with a law requiring towns to record births, marriages, and deaths. These were genuine efforts. The colonial governments recognized, at least in principle, that knowing who lived in their territory was important. But here's the problem. Almost nobody followed through. The Virginia law died almost immediately because the practice was so unfamiliar to church officials that they simply ignored it. In Massachusetts, records were kept, but they were patchy, inconsistent, and full of gaps. A town clerk might record births for a few years, then stop. A new minister might arrive and start a fresh ledger without any connection to the old one. Records were lost in fires, floods, and the general chaos of frontier life. And so, for the vast majority of colonial Americans, and for the Americans who followed them through the Revolution, the early Republic, the Civil War, and the Gilded Age, your birth was not a government event, it was a family event. The most common place where a birth was recorded was in the family Bible. You know those thick, heavy Bibles with the gilded pages and the blank section in the front for recording family milestones? That was not decoration. That was your identity document. Your father or mother, or perhaps a grandparent, would write your name and date of birth on that page, and that entry, written in ink that faded over the decades, was the closest thing you had to proof that you had been born at all. Beyond the family Bible, there were baptismal records. If your family belonged to a church, and most families did, the minister would record the date of your baptism. But baptism was not the same as birth. A child might be baptized days, weeks, or even months after being born, and the baptismal record typically noted the date of the ceremony, not the date of the actual birth. So even if a church record existed, it was often an approximation at best. And then there was simply the testimony of the people who knew you. If someone needed to verify your age or your identity, they did not pull out a certificate. They asked your neighbors. They asked the midwife who delivered you. They asked the people at church, the shopkeeper down the road, the fellow who ran the local mill. In a world of small towns and tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone. Your identity was not a piece of paper. It was a web of human relationships. You were the son of so-and-so, the daughter of the family on the hill, the boy who was born the same winter the river froze over. People placed you in time not by looking at a document, but by remembering the events that surrounded your birth. This might sound quaint and charming, but it was also deeply unreliable, and it created enormous problems as the country began to grow. Because here's the thing about America in the 19th century. It was not sitting still. It was expanding westward at a breathtaking pace. Families packed their belongings into wagons and disappeared over the Appalachians, into the Ohio Valley, across the Great Plains, and beyond. When you moved 1,000 miles from the town where you were born, the web of human relationships that had defined your identity snapped. Nobody in your new community had been at your christening. Nobody knew your parents. Nobody could vouch for how old you were. You were starting fresh, which was liberating in some ways, but it also meant that you had no verifiable past. And this was not just a problem for individuals. It was a problem for the government. The United States Constitution, in Article 1, Section 2, mandated that an actual enumeration of the population be carried out every 10 years. This was not optional. The census was written into the very architecture of the Republic because representation in Congress was apportioned by population. If you did not count the people, you could not run the government. The first census was carried out in 1790, just a year after the Constitution was ratified. It was a monumental task. 650 federal marshals and their assistants fanned out across the original 13 states, plus the districts of Kentucky, Maine, and Vermont, and the Southwest Territory that would become Tennessee. They traveled on horseback and on foot, going door to door, counting heads. The census form was astonishingly simple by modern standards. It asked for just 6 things: the name of the head of the household, the number of free white males aged 16 and older, the number of free white males under 16, the number of free white females, the number of all other free persons, and the number of enslaved individuals. That was it. No birth dates, no birthplaces. No ages for anyone except the rough category of above or below 16 for white males. The final count came in at 3,929,214 people. Both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson suspected this was an undercount, and they were almost certainly right. The country was vast, the infrastructure was terrible, and many people, especially those living on the frontier or in remote areas, were simply missed. The census was a blunt instrument. It could tell you roughly how many people lived in a given area, but it could not tell you who they were when they were born, or whether they were even the same people who had been counted 10 years before. And so, for over a century, the United States operated in a kind of demographic fog. The government knew approximately how many people it had, but it did not know with any precision who those people were. There was no master list of citizens. There was no way to definitively prove when or where you had been born. And for most of American history, nobody cared. The government did not need to know your exact birthday to collect your taxes. It did not need a birth certificate to draft you into the army. It just needed warm bodies. If you looked old enough to fight, you fought. If you owned property, you paid. The system was rough, informal, and deeply personal. It relied on trust, reputation, and the word of the community. But all of that started to change as the 19th century wore on, and it changed because of forces that were far larger than any single individual. The first force was immigration. Between 1815 and 1915, roughly 30 million Europeans crossed the Atlantic and poured into the United States. This was one of the greatest mass migrations in human history, and it fundamentally transformed the country. Cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia swelled with newcomers who spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and had no ties to the existing community networks that had served as informal identity systems. In this new urban landscape, the old ways of knowing who someone was simply did not work anymore. A factory foreman in New York could not ask the local minister about a new worker's family history if the worker had just arrived from a village in Sicily or a shtetl in Poland. The sheer volume of people, strangers to each other and to the authorities, created an identity crisis in the most literal sense. Cities were teeming with people whose names, ages, and origins were essentially unknown. Progressive-era reformers, many of them affluent women, saw this as a crisis that demanded action. They began collecting data obsessively, making maps of where different ethnic groups lived, counting the unemployed, documenting overcrowded tenements and unsanitary living conditions. They were driven by a genuine desire to improve public health and social welfare, but they were also deeply anxious about the flood of unfamiliar faces filling their cities. And when it came to public health, they ran into a wall. They lacked the most basic data about births and deaths. Without knowing how many babies were being born or how many of them were dying, they could not measure infant mortality, they could not track the spread of disease, and they could not make the case for the reforms they were pushing. They needed birth data, and the country simply did not have it. The second force was child labor, and this is where the story takes a darker and more urgent turn. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, America ran on child labor. Factories, mines, mills, and farms employed children in staggering numbers. In 1900, the number of children between the ages of 10 and 14 who worked for wages was 1.75 million. Before the 1890s, many states allowed children to work up to 10 hours a day and up to 60 hours a week. These were not teenagers doing after-school jobs. These were small children, 8, 9, 10 years old, operating dangerous machinery, crawling into coal mine shafts too narrow for adults, and standing on their feet for entire shifts in textile mills. Reformers, particularly those associated with the National Child Labor Committee founded in 1904, began pushing hard for laws that would set minimum age requirements for work. The logic was simple. If a child had to be 14 to work in a factory, then you needed a way to prove a child's age, and this is where things fell apart, because there was no reliable way to do it. The system at the time relied on parental affidavits. A parent would sign a sworn, notarized statement declaring their child's age, and that was supposed to be enough. But parents lied frequently. Working-class families depended on every member contributing financially. And if saying your 12-year-old was 14 meant the difference between eating and going hungry, plenty of parents were willing to bend the truth. And it was not just the parents. The notaries who were supposed to verify these affidavits often looked the other way. Factory inspectors complained endlessly about the problem. In Wisconsin, for example, the state's factory inspector reported that the lack of reliable or complete birth records made enforcement nearly impossible. He noted cases where parents had even altered the dates recorded in their family Bibles to make their children appear older. Historian Susan Pearson, who has written extensively about this period, captured the absurdity of the situation perfectly. She noted that many adults in this era did not even know their own exact birth date. When asked to verify their age at the polling place, few 19th century Americans could do so with any precision. The census of 1900 itself found many individuals unable to supply their age or birth date. Age was not a hard fact in the way we think of it today. It was a rough estimate, a guess, a number that shifted depending on who was asking and why. So the reformers realized something crucial. The solution to enforcing child labor laws was not to trust parents more or hire more inspectors. The solution was to create a document that existed independently of the people involved, a document produced by a professional at the time of birth, stamped and filed by a government office, and retrievable years later when someone needed to prove a child's age. The solution was the birth certificate. And ironically, as Pearson points out, the push for birth certificates required shifting the authority to authenticate a child's birth away from the very people who had actually witnessed it, the parents. A professionally produced birth certificate turned a child's age and identity into what Pearson calls an objective fact, a truth that existed apart from the personal relationships that created the child. New York led the way. In 1903, the state passed a labor law that gave first preference to the birth certificate as proof of age. If no birth certificate was available, inspectors could accept a baptismal certificate, a Bible record, immigration documents, a passport, or even a life insurance policy. Parental affidavits were at the very bottom of the list, accepted only in conjunction with a physical examination by a physician who would certify the child's estimated age by looking at their physical development. Reformers then used New York's law as a template and pushed it state by state across the country. But getting states to require birth certificates was one thing. Actually, recording births was another matter entirely. And this is where the federal government finally enters the picture. In 1902, Congress passed an act that established the Bureau of the Census as a permanent federal agency. Before this, the census had been a temporary operation that spun up every 10 years and then dissolved. With a permanent bureau in place, the government now had the institutional infrastructure to do something it had never done before: develop a standardized system for registering births across the country. In 1907, the Census Bureau proposed the first United States Standard Certificate of Live Birth, a template that states could adopt to ensure their records were compatible with a national system. But here is the catch. The federal government could propose all it wanted. It could not actually force any state to comply. The Constitution did not give Washington the authority to mandate vital records registration. That was a state matter, and many states were in no hurry. The Census Bureau created what it called the Birth Registration Area, a group of states that met certain minimum standards for recording births. In 1915, when the Birth Registration Area was formally established, only 10 states and the District of Columbia qualified. The rest of the country was essentially still in the dark ages of record-keeping. The states that dragged their feet were, predictably, the more rural and less industrialized ones. If you were born on a farm in Texas, South Carolina, or Georgia in the early 1900s, the odds of your birth being officially recorded were slim. There was no hospital, there was no doctor. A midwife delivered you in a back bedroom, and your mother or father might or might not have gotten around to telling the county clerk. Rural areas were especially inconsistent. A baby born on a ranch in 1880s Montana or in the hill country of 1890s Kentucky might have absolutely no official record of their birth beyond a fading entry in a family Bible, if even that. It took until 1933 for all 48 states to finally join the birth registration area. Think about that. The United States did not achieve universal birth registration until 1933. That is 157 years after the Declaration of Independence. It is 44 years after the Eiffel Tower was built. It is 6 years after Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic. The country that was pioneering aviation, building skyscrapers, and electrifying entire cities still had not figured out a basic system for recording who had been born. And even after 1933, the system was far from perfect. Early birth certificates were bare-bones documents. They captured only a brief outline of the child's identity and its parents. And since hospital deliveries were still uncommon, the system missed a huge percentage of people born at home. The first federal birth certificate template in 1900 contained just 33 items of information. It would not be until the 1930s that a truly standardized version was uniformly adopted, and not until 1989 that the format was updated to include checkboxes designed to improve data quality and completeness. The modern birth certificate, with its more than 60 items of information, is a product of over a century of bureaucratic evolution. But the real tipping point, the event that finally made the birth certificate matter to ordinary Americans, was not a law or a reform campaign. It was money. In 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law. It was one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American history, creating a federal safety net that would provide retirement benefits, unemployment insurance, and aid to dependent children. But to qualify for Social Security benefits, you had to prove your age. You had to demonstrate that you were 65 years old and eligible for retirement payments. And the simplest way to do that was to produce a birth certificate. Suddenly, a government-verified birth record was not just a statistical abstraction or tool for child labor enforcement. It was a financial necessity. Millions of Americans who had been born in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, people who had lived their entire lives without anyone asking for documentary proof of their birth, now needed a piece of paper they had never possessed. The demand for what became known as delayed birth certificates surged. These were documents issued retroactively, sometimes decades after the actual birth, based on whatever secondary evidence could be scraped together: census records, old church ledgers, family Bible entries, or sworn affidavits from elderly relatives who could testify that, yes, they remembered when so-and-so was born. The delayed birth certificate is one of those quiet, forgotten artifacts of American history that tells you more about the country than any textbook. Imagine being 65 years old in 1936, having worked your entire life, and being told that to collect the retirement benefits you were promised, you needed a document that had never existed. You would have to go to a government office, track down some kind of evidence that you had been born when and where you said you had, get someone to sign a statement under oath, and hope the bureaucracy accepted it. For many Americans, especially those in rural areas, those who were poor, those who were black, those who were immigrants, this was an enormous hurdle. The system that was supposed to catch everyone had been designed from the very beginning to miss certain people. And then came the war. When the United States entered World War II, the birth certificate went from a financial document to a document of national security. Defense plants and ammunition factories were hiring at an unprecedented pace, but by law they could only employ American citizens. To get a job building the planes, ships, and weapons that would win the war, you had to prove your citizenship. And the primary way to prove your citizenship was to show a birth certificate. This presented a staggering problem. During the period from 1940 to 1945, approximately 43 million Americans, nearly one-third of the entire working population, filed requests with their states to get a certified copy of their birth certificate. 43 million. That is not a bureaucratic footnote. That is a national crisis of identity, a moment when a third of the country had to scramble to prove they were who they said they were. The stories from this period are revealing and sometimes heartbreaking. One man from Rhode Island wrote to the authorities saying that it was America, and it was not right to refuse him a job because he did not have his birth papers, that he had a wife and child, and he wanted to work. A woman named Grace Wilson, 42 years old, from Kansas, hoped to get a job in the aircraft industry but could not even enroll in the training school. She expressed how bitter it felt to know she was an American citizen whose grandparents and parents had also been American, and still not be able to establish her citizenship. These were not edge cases. These were millions of ordinary Americans, born and raised in the country, who had no way to prove it on paper. The system that had relied on community knowledge, on the fact that people knew each other and could vouch for each other, had finally and completely broken down under the weight of a modern, industrial, mobile society. You could not run a world war on the honor system. The wartime crisis finally forced the government to get serious. In 1946, as part of a broader drive to improve national health policies and the welfare state, the Office of Vital Statistics was given responsibility for overseeing birth certificate standards. The states would continue to handle the actual record keeping, but there was now a federal body with the authority and the mandate to ensure that the system actually worked. Now, I want to pause here and talk about something that does not get discussed enough when people tell this story, and that is who got left out. Because the history of the birth certificate in America is not just a story about bureaucratic modernization. It is also a story about exclusion. The communities that were most likely to have their births go unrecorded were the same communities that were already marginalized. Black Americans, particularly in the rural South, were systematically underregistered. If you were born on a sharecropper's farm in Mississippi in 1905, there was no doctor, no hospital, no county clerk paying attention. A midwife delivered you, and your birth may or may not have been reported to anyone in an official capacity. When the Social Security Act came along 30 years later and demanded proof of birth, these were the Americans who had the hardest time producing it. Native Americans faced similar challenges. Many were born on reservations with minimal government infrastructure, and their births were often recorded, if at all, by tribal or mission records that did not interface with state vital statistics systems. Immigrants who arrived as children whose births had been recorded in distant countries or not at all were also caught in the gap. The birth certificate, which was supposed to be a universal guarantee of identity and citizenship, was in practice a document that tracked most precisely the people the government already cared about: white, native-born, urban Americans, with access to hospitals and physicians. This disparity had real consequences. When you could not prove your age, you could be denied Social Security benefits. When you could not prove your citizenship, you could be denied employment. When you could not produce a birth certificate, you could be denied a passport, a driver's license, or enrollment in a public school. The absence of documentation did not mean you did not exist. It meant the state did not recognize your existence, and in a modern bureaucratic society, that distinction could be devastating. And here's the thing that really puts all of this in perspective. The idea that a document should define your identity, that your existence is not fully real until a government office stamps a piece of paper, that idea is staggeringly recent. For most of human history, identity was relational. You were who your community said you were. Your name, your age, your parentage, these were facts maintained by living memory, not by filing cabinets. The birth certificate represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between the individual and the state. A shift from a world where identity was personal and communal to a world where identity is bureaucratic and documentary. And that shift did not happen because someone had a grand philosophical vision. It happened because of a series of very practical crises. Child labor laws needed a way to verify age. Immigration created populations that could not be tracked through traditional community networks. Social Security needed proof of age for benefit eligibility. A world war needed proof of citizenship for defense employment. Each crisis pushed the country a little further toward the system we have today, where a single document issued at the moment of your birth follows you for the rest of your life. There is something both reassuring and unsettling about that. Reassuring because the birth certificate provides a kind of certainty. You were born at this time in this place to these parents. It anchors you in the world, but unsettling because it also means that your identity is, at its foundation, a government construct. The state decides the format. The state issues the document. The state keeps the records. Without that piece of paper, in the eyes of the law, you are nobody. Consider the scale of this even today. The United Nations estimates that globally, around 150 million children under the age of 5 have never had their births registered. Another 55 million have been reported as registered, but have no physical certificate to prove it. For these children, the absence of a birth certificate can mean exclusion from schools, health services, and legal protections against child labor and trafficking. The birth certificate is not just an American story, it is a global story about who gets counted and who gets forgotten. Now, let us bring this back to America and think about what it means. The country that invented modern democracy, that wrote a constitution mandating a census of its people, that fought a civil war over the question of who counted as a full human being, that country did not have a functioning system for recording births until the 20th century. For over 100 years, the government relied on a patchwork of church records, family Bibles, personal testimony, and best guesses. It was a system built on trust, and it worked more or less in a world of small towns and stable communities. But it collapsed completely when confronted with immigration, urbanization, industrialization, and the demands of a modern state. The birth certificate emerged not from some grand plan, but from a series of desperate improvisations. Reformers needed it to fight child labor. Public health officials needed it to track disease. The Social Security Administration needed it to pay benefits. The War Department needed it to verify citizenship. Each of these institutions pulled the birth certificate into existence for its own purposes, and together they created a document that none of them had originally envisioned, the foundational identity document of the modern American citizen. And there is one more layer to this story that is worth mentioning, because it connects directly to the present. The evolution of the birth certificate did not stop in 1946. It kept evolving, growing more detailed, more standardized, and more important with each passing decade. By 1972, federal law required the Social Security Administration to obtain evidence of age, citizenship, and identity for anyone applying for benefits, further cementing the birth certificate as the cornerstone of the American identity system. The number of data points on the standard birth certificate grew from 33 in 1900 to more than 60 by 2003. The document that had started as a simple record of a child's name and parents became a detailed medical and demographic profile, capturing information about the mother's health, the circumstances of the delivery, and a growing list of statistical variables. And as the birth certificate became more important, it also became more contested. Debates over who qualifies for one, what information it should contain, and how it should be used have become deeply political. Questions about citizenship, immigration status, and identity verification are at their core questions about birth certificates. The document that did not exist for the first century of American history is now at the center of some of the most heated arguments in American public life. So the next time you open that drawer and pull out your birth certificate, that faded, creased, official-looking piece of paper with your name and date on it, think about what it represents. It represents a system that took over 150 years to build. It represents the struggles of reformers who fought to end child labor, of immigrants who built new lives in unfamiliar cities, of workers who demanded a safety net in old age, of a nation that mobilized for war and discovered that a third of its people could not prove who they were. It represents a fundamental bargain between the individual and the state, a bargain that says, I will register your existence, and in return, you will be legible to me. You will be countable, taxable, draftable, and eligible. That piece of paper is not just a record of your birth. It is a record of America's slow, messy, contentious journey toward becoming a modern nation. And like so many things in this country's history, the story behind it is far stranger, far more complicated, and far more revealing than most people ever realize. If you found this fascinating, please do like and subscribe to the channel. It would really mean a lot to us. And if you have not already, go check out our other videos. I think you will find them just as eye-opening. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.